Hi, I'm Tyler Harris, and you're listening to the Nebraska Notebook. And this week we've got Mike Zwingman, Agronomy R&D Manager with Central Valley Ag, back on the show, and we're continuing the nitrogen conversation with a timely topic of nitrogen uptake. And last time we talked about the sink-source relationship, Mike, and I kind of wanted to continue along those lines today and talking about some of the recent heavy rainfall events that we've had, because here, or just this week here in Lincoln, we had probably, I think on Monday or Tuesday, 1.5 inches, and I think you mentioned up in Butler County, they got 2 inches. So when we have those rainfall events, what are some of the things that growers need to keep in mind or think about in terms of how much nitrogen loss potential there is?
Keith Byerly and I had an interesting discussion the other day about when we get really big 5-inch rains and there's a considerable amount of water standing, we really ramp up this nitrogen loss conversation. But when we get a 3.5 inch or 3-inch really good soaking rain like we got a couple weeks ago in a lot of places where it came really slow, it never rained really hard, water never stood, everything kind of just soaked in and seeped away, we don't talk about nitrogen loss. And so one of the things I've been talking with growers about lately is really being able to recognize the situations, right? So without any sampling or without any kind of research type data, how do you look at your field and then think about what's going on from that nitrogen cycle standpoint, and what's going on with how the weather has affected the nitrogen cycle and what's going on? That kind of gives us an indication of where to start. And then within a field, right, and this is the other thing I told Keith, is within a field, then you have to kind of look at it in the very microclimate environment. Very rarely do we have a condition for nitrogen loss that takes up an entire cornfield, right? If we do, that's a pretty significant event. But what we do have is we have all these kind of micro areas of the field, the depressions, the low spots, your spots with compaction, that we end up having some of those situations. That's kind of what we need to focus on, is how do we recognize the situation. So like today, I got some pictures from yesterday. If you drove up to Oakland and you're driving along the highway, you would see water standing on both sides of the highway in spots, and on some pretty significant amounts of acreages. That doesn't necessarily mean that we're denitrifying that nitrogen, because you have to think about where that nitrogen is in the nitrogen cycle. You got to think about the conditions for denitrification. And yes, we have a ponded anaerobic situation, but as you and I sit here today, it's 55. The high today is going to be in the mid 50s. The high tomorrow is going to be below 50. However, the weekend is going to be 50. We don't have the temperature to make that reaction really happen, because it takes a warming. Now it's happening to a certain extent, but it's not happening at the greatest of levels.
Yeah, not to the extent where we would have had if we had some of these rainfall events, a few days ago or a week ago, where we had these 90-degree temperatures for several days on end.
Right, and then from the leaching standpoint, this is the other thing Keith and I talked about, is if you had a 5-inch rain that ponded, and some of that water is going to evaporate, but some of it's going to infiltrate down through the soil. And if you had a 3-inch rain that soaked in, if 3 inches of effective water is all that soaked in between those two rainfall events, your leaching potential is exactly the same. So we have to kind of think about these situations, and this is where every day, I know I'm going to go back to this, every day I start to talk more and more about looking at models, and because it gives us an opportunity to visualize that information, right? It gives us an opportunity to take digitally and actually put numbers to our intuition and then help us out. Because at best, we're using bench lab numbers on what loss is. And what we need to know is we're not working in a bench in a lab somewhere. We're out in the middle of a cornfield where we have all these kind of other factors that are going to affect nitrogen loss. So it doesn't mean don't do some investigation when this corn gets a little bigger. We can go into side dress season and kind of pay more attention to what we need to do. it's a lot like the replant situation. Take the due diligence to do the work before just going and making a blanket application or a blanket remediation to maybe a problem that's not necessarily there. And if we've used nitrogen stabilizers, they're doing their job for us today. They're doing the work we want them to do. So that's kind of on the source side, right? I'm not terribly concerned with our nitrogen situation, but I'm not so comfortable with it that I'm like, everything's great. So when this kind of dries off, we're going to go do some sampling. We're going to do some other things. Next week, we're going to start putting some lysimeters in and start measuring nitrates in the soil at different levels. Actually in the water, not in the soil itself.
Oh, wow, yeah.
And kind of get an idea of where nitrogen's living, where nitrogen's presiding, and kind of how we can get the plants to it. That's going to be some pretty cool information here in the next couple weeks. But today I wanted to get corn out of the ground before I did that. And the places that we're doing it, the corn was planted last week. It's just starting to emerge this week. Next week it'll be big enough that I can kind of estimate the stand and put things where they need to be. So that's kind of our...
Yeah, well, and that kind of takes us to the sink side, or the net effective stand percentage side, Mike, which we talked about last time. But when we look at that sink source relationship as it relates to nitrogen uptake, what are some of the factors then that kind of affect that crop nitrogen uptake? And I know you mentioned you're doing some work with lysimeters, and I don't know if that's, you're talking about some of the same technology, I'm assuming, that they've used at the USDA ARS station down in Lubbock, Texas, where they're using weighing lysimeters as a means of measuring ET. Is that kind of along those same concepts there? Or?
It's a little bit. We're actually going to use a vacuum lysimeter and actually draw out of the soil solution. So we're not measuring water loss. We're actually going to try to pull soil solution from different depths, 1 foot, 2 foot, and 3 foot depths. And we're going to do it in a spot of corn that has no nitrogen. And then a little added bonus, we're going to go out to some native prairie that in the last 10 years hasn't had any nitrogen applied to it, and actually see what a native soil mineralizes for nitrogen.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
And use that kind of as our baseline, like without any other influence, this is what's happening. And then without any nitrogen applied, this is what's happening. And then with nitrogen and nitrogen plus stabilizers is what's happening. And so that finishes the source side. The sink side really is, we're out doing stand counts. We're calculating those net effective stand percentages, especially kind of in planting windows. So if you're in that early planting window prior to about the 17th, we're out doing it. If you're in that middle planting window between the 17th and the 22nd, 22nd to the 24th, right before the cool down went in, we're doing it. And then if you're after that, if you're after probably the 1st, we're kind of out checking those too, and just seeing what, and we're targeting hybrids. So we're trying to do the same hybrid under the same farming conditions with different planting dates to kind of... Our Bellwood RD site, I actually have corn that I planted on the 17th, the 26th, and on the 26th soil temperature was 43 degrees, and then on the 12th, and on the 12th the soil temperature was 68. So we're going to have kind of these three. We're going to have a mid to upper 50s, a 43 turning to 39, and we're going to calculate those net effective stand percentages and we're going to track that corn out for a little ways too. So not just what happened in stand establishment, but let's go 2 weeks from now and let's look at root development. Because when it comes to nitrogen uptake, right, as much as we talk about foliar nitrogen and everything else, I'm more concerned with what the root morphology of this corn plant looks like and what that cooling of the soil did to that early planting date, that being in cool soil did to that middle planting date, and what being in a really warm and trending upward soil did for that last planting date on root development, total root mass, how that root has kind of three-dimensionally formed. And do we have any issues that are going to cause us some trepidation when it comes to nitrogen uptake? Because if we don't have the root mass, we aren't occupying the proper volume of soil. If we're not occupying the proper volume of soil, we're not accessing as much water. we're not accessing much water, we're not taking up as much nitrogen. That's the chain effect of that soil temperature root development relationship, right?
And there's also water that goes into that as well. And the interesting thing that in talking with you and Keith last year was discussing this concept of active versus inactive roots and how that is affected by water availability and how it affects nitrogen or nutrient uptake through the roots. Is that kind of along those same lines that follows with that in that thought process of the net effective stand percentage?
Yeah. If you talk about soil in 3 dimensions, right? So from the corn plant, if you look out both the X and the Y axes, that would be down the row and into the middle of the row. And then you look down the Z and you look at the depth. Then you talk about plant spacing and how that affects root morphology. But how we fill with not the big coarse roots, but the really, really fine root hairs that you have to be super careful that you wash off and you don't just shake off, because they're not strong enough that they're more attached to the soil than they are the plant, and because that fine root and those root hairs is where all the activity is. We could get a lot of the conduit like root, the bigger, coarser roots, but all the activity is going to come from the really, really fine roots. And so we need to talk about how those roots have developed. And it just so happens that Bob Wright kind of hinted at this earlier this week, that corn rootworms are going to start hatching, and we kind of have root masses all over the board. And so now we kind of need to look at what kind of damage could be done to some of these young plants with smaller roots and how that affects uptake down the road. And what we're talking about when we talk about efficiency, right, is on the grand scheme of things, this isn't the difference between 240 and 200 bushel corn. This is the difference between 250 bushel corn, where we kind of got to work really hard at it, and 250 bushel corn where we can be really efficient, and we still got to really work at it, but our work pays off. Like, our work is in being more adamant about timing and placement and understanding kind of when the plant needs it, which is a discussion Keith and I had yesterday for kind of down the road. But that understanding what our stand is, and then a couple weeks from now going out and looking at root development, when that corn gets to about the V5 stage, when we start to put on the nodal roots, because that's when the corn plant starts to come into its own, right? Like, it's no longer living off the seed. It's no longer kind of this weak, fragile shell of a corn plant. It starts to get mass, and it starts to lengthen out. We get more leaf area index, and we get to that nodal roots that are built for nitrogen and water uptake, that are built to go out and seek. And that's the root morphology we really want to look at. The young roots are important because that structure is kind of sets the stage, but we don't really know good from great until we get a little later in the season.
Yeah. Well, and that's something that I wanted to bring up too and talk about, Mike, was, like you mentioned, we pay so much attention to leaf area index in crop canopies, and that's obviously a very important thing in all this, but root development plays a very important role as well in terms of that nitrogen uptake. As we progress through the season, one of the things I wanted to talk about was how can growers monitor how much nitrogen is being taken up, and based on what they're finding out there, how can they adjust their situation in season to adjust beyond what deficiencies there might be out in the field?
So there's a myriad of tools, right?
Yeah.
And each one of them has a different level of your input and involvement. So this is a great opportunity for you to work with your trusted advisor and kind of talk about what's right from you. So the best way I can explain it is some of the tools that I'm evaluating today, right? So I'm evaluating different models, and those different models have a certain level of activity, from we put in the plan and kind of let it run and play with some scenarios, to we have a bit more complex. We still build scenarios, but they're kind of based on not what I've done or what I plan on doing, but what I've done and what I should do. And then a set of models that I go do some tissue sampling and it tells me that if I do this, this is what my potential return is, and this is where the crop's at from a yield gap status. And all those are a little bit different. There's also the traditional soil sampling, the PSNTs, and those nitrate tests, and then there's tissue sampling, and so each one of these things gives us a different look. Soil sampling will give us a fair idea of what's in the soil, right? What's available. It's a pretty trustworthy soils source, and I had a conversation about just because we don't measure it in a nitrate or ammonium test doesn't mean it's not there, because those tests don't account for what's caught, what's tied up, or what's in the nitrogen cycle that's going to get released to the plant down the road. Like, just because it's not there doesn't mean it's gone. Tissue samples kind of gives you an idea of where the plant's at from this is what I've done, this is, I probably could have done a little bit better, taken up this. Now, the trick with tissue samples is just because it's deficient in the plant doesn't mean it's not available in the soil. Mm-hmm. Right? And so we have to really temper and think about how we want to manage that situation. And then what I do appreciate about tissue samples, and it's taken me a long time to get here, is, and I wrote my blog article about this a couple weeks ago, is nitrogen management isn't always about nitrogen. I reference it as kind of the Kardashians of the nutrient world. We give it a lot of service, and it carries a lot of weight, right? Like it's got its place in the order of nutrients for a reason. But without potassium and sulfur, it's really hard for us to manage. So like if you're deficient in sulfur or potassium, it's normally going to trigger a nitrogen deficiency in the plant, because we're not moving it, right? Like, or we're not getting it to where it needs to be, or we're not using it appropriately. So what a tissue sample will do is it will tell you the things the soil sample won't. Like, I have plenty of nitrogen here in the soil, I don't have enough in the plant. Well, why is it? Well, that's because I'm short on one of these other two things. And then when we start talking about potassium, I mean, we could do a whole series of podcasts on potassium and how kind of finicky it is in the soil and how that relates back to what it is. Because we might have plenty of nitrogen, but we have cool soils or dry soils, and the clay particles in our soil aren't releasing enough exchangeable potassium for the plant to take it up. Now, you go do a soil test and boom, there's plenty of potassium here, but it's not accessible to the plant. And that's kind of the tissue sampling thing. And then, like I said, the models are going to be that higher level, but I don't think they completely stand alone without some, not every field, but maybe a field where you're using one or a combination of the other two more kind of traditional methods to kind of monitor nitrogen.
Yeah, it sounds like it's easy to kind of have a blind spot unless you pool some of those tools together, right? To kind of have a good sense of where the nitrogen is. And of course, within that nitrogen cycle, residue and some of that biomass too, that's another thing that we've talked about in previous podcasts, is if it's not in the soil, if it's not in the plant, well, where is it? Well, maybe it's, kind of still tied up in some of that residue that's breaking down. And of course, we have some tools, I think, moving forward to monitor that. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, the models are really going to help us with that. And there's one tool I kind of left out, and I was planning a multi-hybrid plot up at Oakland on Saturday, and I was listening to a podcast, and if you want to know what it is, you can go find it on my Twitter page because I posted about it. And it has an agronomist from the Eastern Corn Belt, and she talked about putting hot streaks in, right? So you put a streak of corn in your field that you absolutely know you're not going to be short on nitrogen. And I would take that one step further. If you want to put herd markers out there, put one that we know we're not going to be short, and put one that you know we're not going to have near enough. And not manage your corn to the middle, but it at least give you an idea of what's going on. And so and this is what I do in some of our nitrogen stabilizer trials, right? Is I don't run them at full rates of nitrogen. I pull back about 20%. So on that untreated check, if there's nitrogen loss, I know that I barely have enough nitrogen to get by to where I want to be. If I take the entirety of all credits and everything works great, I'm fine for that yield goal. But if I don't, if I miss some, it's going to show it. And if there's any loss, it's going to show it. I do that for a reason, because that kind of gives me that idea of where loss is and why it happened and when it happened. Like, when did that corn plant really start struggling and showing signs of deficiency? Because that's the other thing. And then also another topic for a long down the road is going from exactly what is your plant doing today. Not over the course of last week, it should have used X amount of water, she used X amount of nitrogen. We don't feed cattle that way. You don't go out and say, well, you should eat this in the next week, right? So we're gonna go up to every feedlot in the state of Nebraska, and we're gonna load the bunks up with a week's worth of feed. So we're gonna talk a little bit about managing on the daily.
That goes back to that plant physiology mindset, and as I understand, Mike, that gets somewhat hybrid specific. And I only bring this up because you mentioned the multi-hybrid planting research you're doing. That's one of those questions I've heard brought to the forefront, is when we talk about nitrogen uptake or nitrogen use efficiency on a hybrid specific level, how do we gauge that? Because I think we're starting to see different seed companies kind of come out with some of that data, providing that information from some of the research trials that are out there. But moving forward, I see that as being kind of one of the challenges in optimizing that nitrogen uptake and nitrogen use efficiency on a hybrid level.
Through the Winfield United answer plot system, and the tools they've given us, we have 2 answer plots within the CVA, 3 actually, within the CVA geography. They've been doing response to nitrogen research on hybrids. I think probably about 15 years is in my recollection, is kind of when we first started talking about it. And they have a pretty good idea of what hybrid characteristics and what hybrid types respond to nitrogen more than others. That becomes an important factor when we start talking about multi-hybrid and nitrogen timing, right?
Yeah.
And I think the other thing we got to realize is there's going to be some root morphology things that kind of help us decide how to make placement decisions. How close do we have to get that nitrogen to the plant? These are all kind of the higher level nitrogen management discussions we need to have. I'm not saying we need to go out and do them today, but we need to start thinking about how we implement that stuff. But understanding how your hybrid responds to nitrogen is very important. And then knowing how your hybrid responds to population. So you start with that NESP, right? And if you have a hybrid that's a really, really poor responder to population, that means it falls into that semi-flex to flex category. So if your NESP is a little lower, it's going to be okay. But if you have a really, really fixed hybrid that is really, really population driven, next thing you know, you've lost 20% of your stand, that's going to ouch. That's where that true 8 bushels per thousand comes in. Where on that semi-flex, it might only be 5 that you get affected. Then when you look at from there, now what's a response to nitrogen? Because maybe with what happened, this responder to populations can survive on less nitrogen per unit, right? Well, maybe the nitrogen I have out is okay and I don't have to make that last fertigation pass or that last thing. But maybe this one that there's a lower responder to populations, a higher responder to nitrogen, and to get the most out of that reduced stand, you have to kind of ramp it up just a little bit, right? Like you have to push it. Those are the...
What I'm hearing is that hybrids that are responders to population that's not necessarily correlated to being a responder to nitrogen. So that's where it gets a little bit tricky in terms of having that data available and making sure that the grower knows the characteristics of that hybrid. And with my responsibility at CVA, I've kind of spent the last 3 or 4 years kind of
on the sideline of the seed discussion.
Yeah.
But now, like when we talk about this, I spend a lot of time asking our FSAs, or field sales agronomists, or our seed leads who spend hours and hours and hours training on hybrids. I start asking them questions about, I just did it this week. We were in Iowa on Tuesday up at Akron planning another multi-hybrid trial in our up there, and 2 hybrids that I've never had any exposure to, right? So I spent a half hour talking with the grower and talking with the field sales agronomist about why those are the 2 hybrids they wanted to use, to make a decision which one I put in which situation in the multi-hybrid, to make sure that I was matching things up correctly. And then talking about how we manage the nitrogen going forward. So like it's going to take somebody who is deeply involved and deeply knowledgeable in that, plus being able to estimate what your yield potential might be, or estimate how things are responding based on the net effective stand percentage, the root development, the progress of your corn crop, all the way to understanding, modeling, and the science behind soil sampling and tissue sampling to put you in a position to start to master this whole thing.
Yeah, really being able to tie it in full circle and having that localized knowledge and an understanding of what a realistic yield expectation is for that field too.
And for as much as the models or all these outside companies want to help growers from afar, right? There's a simple fact that has withstood the test of time in our industry. All agronomy is local. I can talk to the greatest agronomists in Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, and to a certain extent, we can agree on a lot of things. But there are things about each one of our situations that is pertinent to how we go about managing a corn crop. Now, fundamentally, we're not that much different, but it's in the nuances, right? Mm-hmm. The Army Rangers talk a lot about the details matter. Well, from 1,000 miles away, it's hard to manage the details. And with AI, it's hard to manage the details. And that's where I think having well-trained, strong agronomy people that can help you manage that understand all those little pieces and how they fit together, and every once in a while we might have to take one, we might have to give it a good tap to get it in. Not that means it doesn't fit, just wasn't cut exactly right. That's how we get to where we want to be. And that's how we help you, the grower, manage your bottom line. And the thing is, the state is full of capable agronomists that can do that.
Yeah,
absolutely full. And so that's the cool part, right? Like, there's not a small group of agronomists leading the charge in this. There's a big group of people that can do this. But it's about building the right relationships and right understanding and building a level of trust that lets you take something so tough, so complicated, and not to mention one of the biggest drivers of your yield, and do all this stuff. That's the kind of cool and scary part all at the same time.
While we've got time, Mike, I also wanted to touch base on nitrogen assimilator tools. That's something we've talked about in the past, and I know that's something that might be a little localized as well, but based on your experience with some of these tools, how can that play a role within the nitrogen uptake cycle? And
so I'm going to even expand on that a little bit more.
Yeah.
I'm going to say that the things that help with plant health, the things that lower plant stress, the plant growth regulators and the plant growth assimilators all kind of have a magical position in this deal. Because you get plant growth regulators, and some of the stress reducers will drive some root development that takes up yield, takes up nitrogen. The stress reducer is kind of the same thing. The assimilators, on the other hand, what that does is it kind of creates this, plants in nature, if they know there's a lot of nitrogen around them, they're going to be like, I'll get to that later, right? Like, it'll be there. And the plant just takes it up and kind of on its own time, right? But if you trick it, and if we went to a native prairie, right, and this is kind of where this idea of doing these native prairie things is when there's not a lot of nitrogen in that system, but the moment there is, all plants go and scavenge it. So we make ravengers out of them, right? And then once we get nitrogen into the plant, that's the safest place for it, right? Can't lose it to leaching. Well, we can, but not till later in the year. We don't lose it to denitrification. It's in the plant. And then it's a matter of flipping the right switches and affecting the right biochemical reactions to get it assimilated into the form the plant's going to use it, and then reallocated to where the plant needs it the most. So in the corn plant's particular case, it's the ear, right? Like we want to get that in the grain. So there's been some interesting questions. You get after black layer, you pull ear corn, you pull an ear leaf, and then you go take a stock nitrate test, right? And there's not a lot of nitrogen in the grain. There's the ear leaf is deficient, but you look at that 12 and 18 inches of stalk and you're like, there's a lot of nitrogen there, right? Why? Well, we took it in, we stored it, which is one of the three functions of the stalk, right? But we didn't reallocate it efficiently enough to drive it to the ear. And we need nitrogen to build starch, we need nitrogen to build proteins, and corn in particular, we need three things that build test weight: nitrogen, water, and sunlight, right? And if we run short on any one of those three, we start to lose test weight opportunity. Well, we can pack on more test weight if we can get more nitrogen in the air. And that's where the kind of assimilator group comes into play. And we're going to do some interesting things with that assimilator group to try to drive some nitrogen efficiency, because we talked about this yesterday. Whenever we add something, we got to take something away, right? To help manage your bottom line. If I add $6 here, I need to remove $6 over there.
Yeah.
Right? Like it needs not remove $6. I either need to be able to take $6 away because I was using it when I shouldn't have, or it needs to create 12, right? And so that's kind of where we're going to start playing with this is, can we get it? If I do this, do I get that? And what timing is going to give me the greatest probability of that?
Well, and also the combination of factors that can mitigate that stress and set that plant up to use and uptake that nitrogen and use it in the most efficient way possible, from the sound of it.
So that's kind of like that what I get to work on the rest of the summer, right? And I get to go play with my little chemistry set out in the middle of a cornfield and try different things to see what happens. And we're really excited because I think all in all, for what we've been through, stands are not perfect, but way better than they could have been. We didn't have near the cresting issue some of the rest of the Corn Belt had. We haven't had near the flooding issue, near the washing out issue. When you go look at stands across planting dates, they are fairly decent for what we've been through. And there's exceptions to that rule, but I think as of today, we go a couple weeks from now when that corn gets to be like this and we start to look at root development, we start to talk about that. Now we're going to get to have a different conversation. But I think if I had more skin in the game than I did, I would continue on my nitrogen plan today for the most part.
Because based on where we're at, we haven't gone off on too much of a tangent from the original plan.
Even if we got done planting this week, which we won't, but a lot of growers got done planting in this week last year.
Yeah.
Right? Like, so we're the crop's in plenty early. We got all this stuff going for us. When we get through, I'm actually, a little bit of me is glad we've gotten the moisture we've had, because some of these soils that we probably planted in the marginal category, we were going to need some moisture to protect us from getting some things like floppy corn syndrome a little bit down the road, because we were getting fairly dry. So those 80, 90 degree days and 30, 40 mile an hour wind kind of took the goodie out of it. So I think we're in position to really make good decisions from here on out and help manage your bottom line and get you to those goals. But it also, knowing that we kind of got a good situation, it gives us some room to make some decisions on becoming more efficient or driving. And some of those really, really good stands in your best areas, maybe driving a little more.
seeing what the best possible outcome is
Yep.
for that particular scenario.
And through the modeling process, we can run those scenarios, right?
Exactly.
We can talk about that.
Well, and moving forward, we'll have a lot to talk about in future podcasts and in upcoming Nebraska Farmer articles. Be sure to follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/Nebraska Farmer Magazine. And thanks for listening to the Nebraska Notebook.